Hello and welcome to the Idaho Reports podcast. I'm Logan Finney. Joining me this week to talk about how drought conditions are impacting northern Idaho over the last few water seasons is Robin Fox, who's a service hydrologist with the National Weather Service out of Spokane. Robin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be there.
So we're talking to you after the Idaho Department of Water Resources held its fall Water Supply Committee meeting in Boise this week. For listeners who aren't really familiar with the Department of Water Resources and this committee, are you able to give us kind of some background on what this group is?
So the Water Supply Committee in Idaho, what they have made up of many different agencies that discuss the different sources and views of water supply so they can plan accordingly for the upcoming year. And they meet regularly, especially during the cold season, and first monitor how much snowpack is in the mountains and then make plans on how that's going to benefit and make water supply forecasts for later in the warm season.
Yeah, it was a very informative day, the part of it that I attended, and you presented specifically on how conditions are in northern Idaho as compared to the rest of the state. Of course, it makes sense to have you talk about that, being from Spokane rather than down here in Boise. But what do you see as the benefit of focusing on North Idaho specifically in this broader context of water in Idaho?
Well, in North Idaho has been in a long-term drought for the past 2 years, while the southern portions of the state did see some beneficial rain and snow during that time. So focusing on North Idaho was important because they've had moderate to severe drought since the fall of 2022. And, the different water sources and terrain makes it different than the southern part of the state.
Sure, those glacial lakes up there are a really different area than the broad Snake River Plain.
Correct.
In your presentation, you said that overall the Panhandle saw rainfall deficits this year of an inch or less, but the central part of the Panhandle, kind of the Moscow area, saw greater deficits. Am I remembering that right?
Yes, correct. So we saw more deficits happening in the mountains, due in part to the lack of the snowpack that we had, especially this last winter. And we were noticing some deficits near Priest River and Sandpoint that were less than an inch, along with Lewiston as well. But from the Palouse area around Moscow into the central Panhandle Mountains, those deficits grew to be anywhere from 5 to almost 8 inches during the water year. And the water year goes from October 1 all the way through September 30th, and that is to capture all of that winter cold season precipitation.
Sure, that's kind of the entire purpose of Idaho's reservoir systems is to catch all that water. Well, first it gets caught as snow in the mountains, but then as it runs down off the mountains, to catch it early in the spring so that we can use it all through the summer and the fall growing season, right?
Yes, correct. That is correct.
As we look at North Idaho coming through this drought season, or these last couple seasons facing drought, what sort of effects has that had on the region?
Well, initially with a lower snowpack, that is a concern when we're starting to look at water supply forecasts and how we're going to use that water throughout the year. But initially, seeing that lack of a snowpack for North Idaho, that does affect winter recreation. And I was able to reach out to some of the ski resorts and find out how their season went. And found out that it was really difficult for them to open at during the holidays. Some of them, I think maybe one was able to open by Thanksgiving weekend, but it was pretty limited all the way through the holidays because of the lack of the snowpack. Those that could make snow did, but others had to move it around a lot to be able to make the skiing a benefit for those that came to use their facilities. But overall, I think their attendance was low at many of the ski resorts in North Idaho. So that was a big one. And then with agriculture, we did have some good precipitation during the cold season, the fall into the winter. It didn't fall as snow per se, but a lot of the dry land agriculture over the Palouse, their winter wheat crops seem to benefit from that. Unfortunately, by the time we got to the spring planting with the spring wheat and the legumes, those saw less yields, partly because of the lack of precipitation that we were receiving by that time. And also for the central part of the Panhandle, across the Palouse, down to the southern part, the grazing areas, they were drying up so quickly. Ponds were drying up as well. So that did affect a lot of the producers in the area.
You also said that some wet conditions up in Bonner and Boundary counties prevented or delayed planting up there because it was so wet and muddy?
Yeah, it was, we kind of spanned the extremes. So a lot of the precipitation, we had to look at the timing and the distribution of that and how that affected agriculture. So we got a report, a drought report from one of our observers up in the northern part of the Panhandle, and they were talking about in March how muddy and wet it was with the precipitation from that. So that delayed them putting in their spring crops.
Yeah, and something that stood out to me, for context, I grew up in Sandpoint on Lake Pend Oreille, and I know how those creeks up there behave through the seasons, and you said there was no flooding up there during the spring runoff season this year.
No. Yes, that was something that was, I remembered, being a hydrologist, I'm kind of keyed into the high flows, and we didn't really have them. Not even from Pack Creek down to Paradise Creek. They all stayed within their banks, so that was pretty surprising.
Well, as we're looking at long-term trends up here, we've seen North Idaho in these several years of drought. Looking ahead the next couple of years, what do we see in the forecasting pictures?
Oh, well, I like to look out just in the next year. Our skill going beyond that is a little not as good. But
that's fair.
For this coming winter, we're going to flip the weather pattern a bit. So last year it was an El Nino winter, which develops a strong jet that goes across the southern portions of the United States and keeps us in the inland Northwest more on the mild side with less precipitation. So that makes sense. We were kind of anticipating that was going to be happening for this last winter. So for this coming winter, things are flipped. We're going into a La Nina winter. So what that does is it brings a more active northerly jet, so bringing the storm track back over our area. So anticipating wetter conditions and somewhat cooler conditions, especially as we get into the latter part of the winter. So we've seen La Ninas before, and they usually do help build the snowpack. So I think we should be seeing some improvements from the drought conditions as we go through the winter season.
All right. Well, Robin Fox with the National Weather Service out of Spokane, thank you so much for coming on the show this week.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Programming support is provided by the Idaho Humanities Council, deepening understanding of the shared human experience by connecting people with ideas and local public programs exploring history, law, literature, and citizenship through the humanities.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.